Hi, this is Curtis with Sabbath School Coaching, and I wanted to send this out to my fellow Sabbath School teachers as we're going through the book of Galatians this quarter. I thought I would share another insight to keep in mind as we seek to guide our classes through this very, very important book of the Bible, the book of Galatians. It was titled, this message that I'm sending to you is titled, O Foolish Galatians, which is taken from Galatians chapter 3, verse 1, and it reads as the following. O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth crucified among you? And this one verse gives us a lot of insight into why Paul wrote this letter to the early church in Galatia. Paul did not write this letter as a letter of inspiration or as a sermon outline or just a series. Paul wrote this letter because it was a crisis at the church. The early church had formed, and Paul and others were starting new churches in the Gentile communities. And it would be great to say that they had no issues, no drama, but as anything dealing with the work of God, there will be issues. And Paul wrote this letter to address a problem that the early church was having. He got wind of what was happening, and he is writing this letter to help the church deal with this crisis. And the gist of it was that we could find out a lot of it is from what the issue was. We'll go back to an earlier book, to Acts chapter 15. Acts chapter 15 and verse 1, because we asked, well, what was the issue that they were dealing with? What was the early church wrestling with? We like to talk about in today's terms that justification by faith, righteousness by faith. We use those terms, but you won't find those same terms used as we use them now. But we will find is that Paul was addressing a particular issue. And here's some insight into what the issue was. This is from Acts chapter 15, verse 1. And it reads, it says, And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, Except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved. This was the big litmus test that many people were pushing, that you needed to be circumcised. This is why they convened all the early leaders to have this discussion, to talk about what they would talk to the Gentiles and what requirements would be made. But there was a certain segment of the growing church that was pushing that everyone needed to be circumcised if they were to be added to this church. And we ask ourselves, why would they do this? As a matter of fact, if we look through some of the earlier writings, even dealing with Jesus' time and Peter and others, that there was a certain sect called of the circumcision. That was their thrust, the circumcision. And they were very, very legalistic. And they were trying to push this approach on the early church. And I asked myself that why were they so adamant about pushing adherence to the ceremonial laws and to circumcision? Why were they so adamant? And Jesus talked about this issue. And I just want to share a few texts that I think that will give us a broader insight into what was happening. We're going to go to Luke chapter 18, and we'll see that this was not a problem that was just new to the church, even though it was threatening the early church. This was something that Jesus dealt with throughout his ministry. And Luke chapter 18 gives some nice insight into it. And I won't read it all, but this is from the very popular story about the two worshipers. And it says, And he spake this parable, starting in Luke chapter 18, verse 9. And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves. That's a key word right there, a key phrase. He spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves, that they were righteous. They trusted what they did and the things they observed and the things they did not do as an indication that they were righteous, and despised others. They looked down on those who weren't the same. It says, two men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee, the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus within himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all I possess. So these men were using their acts of righteousness, as they termed it, as an indication of their closeness with God. I mean, this was so outlandish that in the story that Jesus is telling, the Pharisee looks at the other person and says, I'm glad I'm not like that guy. That takes a lot of gall. And Paul addresses this text and kind of gives us a clear insight into what was happening. So let's look at Romans chapter 10. Romans chapter 10, and we'll just, Romans chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. This is speaking about that same sentiment that Jesus addressed in that story about the two worshipers. Romans 10 says, Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. For they being ignorant of God's righteousness. This is Paul just speaking plainly. For they being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believeth. For Moses describeth the righteousness which is of the law, that the man which doeth those things shall live by them. Paul is saying that these people were going about to establish their own righteousness and not submitting themselves to God. And that same sentiment was something that even the early disciples wrestled with. You remember the story that when Jesus was with his disciples and they saw the blind man who was blind since his birth. The disciples asked very sincerely, who sinned? Was it this man? I don't even know how they could have asked that question. Did he sin? Or did his parents sin that caused him to lose favor with God, that this is the condition that he's in? And Jesus had to give them some correction to let them know that is not why he's in this particular case. But even in as bad of a situation as he was, they would see the glory of God. And on, Jesus had this issue where he would run into this arguments with the Pharisees, and Jesus would say something and they would say, well, we're Abraham's seed. You know, we were never in bondage to any man. We're free. We're Abraham's seed. And Jesus had to tell them that they were indeed slaves to sin. And this same sentiment, this desire to establish their righteousness by their deeds was trying to force its way into the church. And you ask, well, why would they do that? The simple answer is that it is a resistance of the heart, a refusal to yield the heart that causes righteous people to turn to things that they can measure as an indication of their closeness with God. It's the heart that God is after. It's the externals happens when God gets the heart, but these people were pushing the externals as a litmus test into who could join the early church. And so the reason that they could find some success in the early church, which we still see the same thing, that these people of the circumcision would find people in the church who were Jewish by birth. They weren't Gentiles, and they would find their way to get close to these people and spread rumors and dissension about Paul and suggestions about Paul, and to turn the people away from Paul back to ceremonial laws. And that was the issue that was facing the church. These people were trying to turn the early believers back to observing ceremonial laws, and in particular, we hear them speak about the circumcision. That is why Paul wrote this book. He wrote this book because the church was being threatened, just as our church is today. One could ask, well, what difference does it really make? As long as they were members of the church, as long as they were being a part of the body, what difference did it make? Paul saw the danger in building your relationship and growing the church that was not based on solely on the merits of Jesus Christ, solely on his righteousness, solely on his forgiveness, solely on his grace. And we have the same issue today, that as we discuss this lesson with our classes, we don't want to just make it a history lesson and just talking about the facts of righteousness and justification. The truth is that we all have the same battle to shift our trust from God to ourselves. We then start to trust what we can do, what we have done, what gifts we have to indicate how close we are to God, and conversely, how far other people are away. That's why judging is so prevalent, that we look at externals. When people come in and out of our body, we judge them on what we feel are the standards of acceptable righteousness with God, not realizing that all of us are like that publican when Jesus told the story of the two worshipers. All of us have to be in that position where all we can say, "Oh, wretched man that I am, who can deliver me?" The answer is God can deliver us. God is able to do that. On our own, we cannot. So I just hope that as you go through this quarter, that you keep in mind the purpose that Paul wrote this letter, and the fight that he was against, and how we have to guard against the same thing happening in the body of Christ today, and with the same earnestness of Paul, that we too should be trying to make sure that we and those that we influence are trusting only in God and not in ourselves. I hope this blesses you as you go through this quarter, and that you help your members and yourself at the same time to trust more in God and less in ourselves. God bless you all in your ministry.